So, private boarding school is one example. Um, absolutely the military. And I'm going to refer to another example that I've already referred to in the past, and that is the Stanford prison experiment. Occurred in 1970 in California, conducted by Dr. Philip Zimbardo. This is him here. And I'm going to go into quite a bit more detail about it. Now, this was actually funded by the U.S. Naval Research Office. And the whole goal of the experiment, the purpose of it, was to help provide insight into difficulties between prisoners and guards in the U.S. Navy. That was the original purpose, even though that has been almost completely lost in the face of what took place during the experiment. Few people are aware of who funded it to begin with and what the goal of it was. As I've said before, Dr. Zimbardo constructed a fake prison in the bottom of the psychology building on campus. He recruited male students to fill the role of either a guard or a prisoner, and students were paid to participate. They were actually paid a pretty good rate for the day. It would be about $90 a day now, so for a student, that's pretty good. And then they were randomly assigned to either the prisoner group or the guard group. Remember how important it is to randomly choose subjects according to research methods. All men in the study, and this is important, all of them had to undergo a bit of a psychological evaluation. It was determined that none of them had mental health issues at all in the past, and they also only took students who did not have any criminal history at all. And this is important, that they had no previous experience with the penal system, because that might have influenced their perceptions and their behaviors. So here we have a picture of students being arrested. Dr. Zimbardo employed the service of the local police department to arrest participants who were assigned to the prisoner group for the study, because he wanted the experience to be as real as possible. And if you had a warrant out for your arrest, this is what would have happened. Then, when the fake prisoners were taken to the fake prison, they went through a booking process just like they would have if they had been really arrested. They were read their rights, fingerprinted, deloused, given their prison uniform and a kind of cap to wear. They were actually chained on one ankle and left blindfolded in their cells that held a cot and nothing else, a cot with a thin mattress and nothing else. And again, this might seem a little extreme, but developing this kind of intense realism added to the sense of confusion among the prisoners. And Dr. Zimbardo noted that this procedure was meant to cause humiliation of the prisoners and further enforce the oppressive nature of a prison, just like if you were there. Prisoners were given an ID number, like I said, and forced to wear this cap on their head. And this was also to clearly distinguish them even more from guards. The guards were given matching khaki uniforms, billy clubs, and these mirrored sunglasses, so it completely eliminated all eye contact with prisoners. These were very popular during the 70s. Now, just as in a real prison, the guards had their own living quarters, so it's not that the people who were in the guard group were allowed to go home at the end of the day. They had living quarters and a living area there that was completely separate from the prisoners, and that was very, very comfortable. Guards were not given any really specific instructions to behave in a certain way or to handle the prisoners in a certain way. Yes, they were told you cannot harm them or withhold food or drink. But in an orientation session, the day before it started, which was all recorded, they were told, and this is a direct quote, "You can create in the prisoners feelings of boredom, a sense of fear to some degree. You can create a notion of arbitrariness, that their life is totally controlled by us, by the system, you, me, and they'll have no privacy. We're going to take away their individuality in various ways. In general, what this all leads to is a sense of powerlessness. That is, in this situation, we will have all the power and they'll have none." End quote. And to further reinforce to the prisoners that they were prisoners, and that to the guards, they were just prisoners. Guards were told only to refer to them by their ID number, never by a name. Now, very, very quickly, much quicker than anticipated, The guards truly took on the stereotypical authoritarian personality of a guard and subjected some prisoners to what amounted to psychological abuse. They would force the prisoners to repeat their ID numbers over and over and over and over to reinforce that they had a new identity. They encouraged prisoners to harass each other. They would only allow them to urinate or defecate in a bucket in their cell, but then wouldn't let them empty it. They would take the only bit of comfort they had in their cell, which were mattresses and highly valued. They would even confiscate their clothing sometimes, so they would be naked. So on the screen is a picture in the middle of a guy. You can see he's got no shirt on from the chest up. He's completely naked. They've taken their clothes. And at one point, the guards even attacked the prisoners with fire extinguishers when the research staff were not supervising them. So to summarize all of this, as the experiment progressed, the fake guards became quickly more and more cruel without being instructed to do so. This behavior developed on its own, without direction from Dr. Zimbardo or the research staff. And when the experiment was prematurely halted, some of the guards were so into their role, they had embraced it so much, that they were genuinely upset. They wanted the experiment to continue. How did the fake prisoners react? Some of the prisoners passively accepted the psychological abuse. Some actively harassed other prisoners who tried to stop it. And originally the study was to last 14 days, 2 weeks. But over the duration of the study, the treatment towards the prisoners developed to such a traumatic extent that the experiment was halted after 6 days of study. And I think it goes without saying that Dr. Zimbardo should have halted the experiment even sooner than he did. Read the description in the textbook. And I also urge you to Google it. Go online and search Stanford Prison Experiment, because it is really, really interesting. So overall, though, what are we looking at this for? What do we take away from this failed experiment that is still so well known, that is still talked about so much in textbooks and classes, even though it happened so long ago? We're focusing on this for the purposes of this course regarding socialization and how the roles we are socialized to take on are not as fixed or as permanent as we like to think they are. So if, like these students, you suddenly find yourself in a setting much, much different from that to which you're accustomed, for whatever reason, your sense of self might shift, affecting your patterns of behavior. Another very extreme of a total institution and what can happen is Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and how members of the United States Army physically and sexually assaulted prisoners there, tortured them, sodomized them, raped them, violated their human rights. And in 2004, it all became public when photographs of some of this were brought to the media. I only have one picture here because the photographs are so graphic. I didn't want to offend anybody or upset anybody by including them in this, but if you Google this, you can see all the pictures of what occurred. How could these soldiers working in the prison do such things? How could these soldiers do such violent and heinous things like it was okay? Soldiers who, for all intents and purposes, were typical normal soldiers. This really called into question just what kind of training soldiers receive in terms of being taught to follow authority no matter what, to follow the examples of other soldiers in a higher position than them, as well as the general purpose of a boot camp to kind of break down a person's identity and then rebuild it as a soldier. What happened at Abu Ghraib was at the top of the news for months and months and months, and the soldiers who were part of it will always be associated with it no matter what they do. And remember, we're not just talking about prisoners being tortured here to gain information as you would see in the movies. We're talking about really disturbing things that were completely inappropriate and wrong and out of control. And again, the reason we're looking at that here or at the Stanford Prison Experiment is because they are well-known examples of re-socialization, how that can occur with seemingly typical, normal, stable people, as well as the effect of being in a total institution, whether that's a fake prison or a real prison, how that socializes people to change their behavior compared to what their behavior would be outside that institution. So we're winding down this discussion about socialization. We've covered a lot, and I've gone into quite a bit of detail with some of the examples to help explain what the terms and concepts mean, and also to kind of bring them to life for you, to make them more than just something you need to memorize for a quiz. So continuing with this, so let's take a look at the last general subject in the textbook. And it sounds like an all-encompassing kind of thing, and that is socialization across the life course. But that really is what we've been talking about throughout this whole week, throughout this whole chapter. Focusing on socialization, and also just remember you can always pause this presentation if you want, or watch it in parts. So as I've said more than once, as long as you are alive, you're undergoing socialization. You have a new boyfriend or girlfriend, you break up. You move out on your own, or you have roommates. You move in with somebody, you get married, you have children, you get divorced. All of these events, as well as many, many more, will bring about new experiences of socialization. So another way of looking at this is, in a way, it's like you're always preparing for a new role in life. At various stages in life, you'll find yourself taking on a new role, or the expectations you have in a role changing. So as a parent, the way you view parenting and what you do as a parent changes as your child ages. And remember that life doesn't always go into plan. I mean, of course, you know this logically speaking. But what I mean is, as life progresses, you never know what's going to happen. And that may sound a bit hokey, but it's true. What we're doing is we're going through anticipatory socialization. You're learning norms and behaviors of the roles that you aspire to. I mean, you can look at this in terms of your education. You learn the norms and behaviors to become a teacher. You learn the norms and behaviors to become a nurse. So generally speaking, people occupy a lot more roles than they ever have in the past. And our roles in life change at a faster pace than they did in the past. So I'm going to have you kind of visualize again. I want you to picture wherever you're living, town, city, whatever. I want you to picture that place in 1850. How many different occupations were there in 1850? How much variation was there in life in general? Now think of your community now and the thousands of different occupations, how daily family life has changed, and as a result of this, how many different roles a person could potentially occupy, either permanently or temporarily. Now, in part, this is due to globalization, and in part, it's simply due to how socialization takes place now. The opportunities we have socially speaking, and the opportunities we have to change ourselves or reinvent ourselves, socially speaking. And the textbook makes kind of a point of this, really focusing on the idea of being able to reinvent yourself or being able to change your actual identity. So that in the text, you'll see these two pictures of the same woman, on the left before she has plastic surgery and on the right after the procedures have been done. Now, first of all, I have to laugh a little sarcastically because in these before and after pictures, the person is always made to look as unhappy and miserable as possible, as they can possibly be in the before picture, to make the difference that much more dramatic. Marketing at work, I guess. But the fact is, in our modern society, we can take purposeful and active steps to change who we are in a very real sense. Some people don't like this. They have a negative opinion of it. Some people feel that people should be happy with who they are. And if you're not happy with who you are, then you should learn to be that happy and focus on who they are inside. Is this a valid point, a valid perspective? Absolutely it is. But at the same time, you could argue that if a person has the ability to do something to make themselves feel better, shouldn't they be able to do that? It's all a matter of personal opinion. I'm not going to tell you that one opinion is right or wrong. I am going to point out how much more common physically changing one's appearance is, and how that affects your self-esteem. So, in 2015, more than 1.7 million Americans underwent some kind of cosmetics procedure. And here on the screen, you won't be asked this in a test or on the quiz or on the final exam, but here we have some ideas of what has taken place in Canada. So, in relation to cosmetic surgery and purposefully changing your identity physically and thus affecting your social identity, it's now much more common for a person to undergo, for example, a sex change if they want to be transgendered if they want to. The fact is, in our modern society, it is simply much easier than in the past to really change who you are, not just socially but physically, which then in turn absolutely affects your sense of self. And again, is this a positive development in our society overall that allows the people the freedom to be who they want to be who they truly feel they are and can be, without fear of worry or a negative consequence? Or is this a negative development for society overall, allowing and maybe even encouraging people not to accept themselves for how they were born and feeling as if they somehow have to change who they are physically to be accepted socially? I don't know. I certainly have my own opinion. You'll have yours. I'm not here to try to convince you one way or the other. I'm just presenting the issue to you, to introduce you to it, and to encourage you to view it from a sociological perspective. As the text points out, we really need to acknowledge, though, how much all of this has been aided by the internet, if not outright encouraged by it. Something you may be completely 100% used to, you're acclimated to it depending on your age, and to you it's just part of life, it's always been present in the world. If you're young enough to view the internet that way, I just want to remind you that it hasn't actually been around for very long. It wasn't until the 90s that it became widespread. Now, virtual communities allow people to communicate, even if they're separated by great distances, about something they have in common, something they have a common interest in, which has helped to encourage and shape how people socialize and thus how they form their sense of self. And virtual communities could absolutely have a positive effect by acting as a social support for people who may not have one in their daily life. They can help a person work through difficulties they're having. They can help you become who you really want to be, or help you to conceal in whole or part who you really are. So somebody who is naturally very shy and passive and quiet in real life, when online, can be forward and bold and demanding, or vice versa. Remember, your sense of self is not fixed. It's flexible. It's fluid. It's always evolving and changing. For me, the example that comes to mind when I think about a virtual community providing support is I think about a young boy or girl living in a small-ish town that doesn't have a lot of diversity, kind of like your stereotypical kind of conservative small town, who knows deep down that they're gay, but there's nobody in their immediate vicinity that they can comfortably talk about this with. So they feel like an outsider. They feel like nobody would understand them. But online, they can connect with other teens who are feeling the same way. At the same time, while the prevalence of the internet and virtual communities has a very big positive side to it, so it's allowed people from all walks of life or from any social status more freedom to be who they want to be, they can also be damaging. For example, there are some virtual communities based on or encouraging people who are anorexic or bulimic to continue that. These are called pro-ana sites, meaning they are pro-anorexic. So they refer to anorexia as Anna, and they refer to bulimia as Mia. So they provide what they call thinspiration in continuing to maintain an eating disorder. Tips to try to avoid feelings of hunger, how to hide it when you've thrown up, how to hide food. So there's absolutely a downside to this as well. And if we step back and look at socialization of young people as a whole, kind of stand back and look at the big picture, there are absolutely noticeable difficulties with how children and adolescents are socialized today compared to the past. There certainly has been overall a decline in adult supervision, or at least a decline in guidance. Picture yourself at somewhere between the ages of 14 and 16 in 1855, what your daily life would have been like in terms of who you interacted with, who you spent the majority of your time with, who had the most influence over you, all those things. And the answer to that is your family. Now I want you to picture yourself In the 50s, industrialization would have occurred decades ago, and I want you to consider the same questions. What your daily life as a young person would have been like in the 50s, who you spent the majority of your time with, and how all of that affected you, who had the biggest influence over you. And then picture yourself if you were 14 or 16 now and ask yourself the same questions. Who has the big influence over you over now? As society has progressed from pre-industrial times to the present, adult supervision has surely but slowly declined. Both mom and dad usually spend their days at work, kids spend their days at school or in daycare. And what has happened? This has led to what I've already discussed, peer groups playing much bigger a role with socialization. Because in a lot of ways, youth are left to socialize on their own. And this can unfortunately lead to negative situations, to bad choices. At the same time, the mass media has stepped in with its own influence thrown into the mix. The rise of the internet and technology. And certainly cell phones have played a huge role in this. Just to give you an example, I saw just yesterday, I was at my local YMCA. There was an aquatics competition going on. And one of the teams that wasn't currently competing were sitting there on a bench. And every single kid, and I'm not exaggerating, they're sitting there on the bench with their hands on their knees and their faces on their phone. Nobody was talking to each other. And these days, what might also play into this, parents having less supervision and guidance, is just how adolescence has evolved for young people. Young people have jobs and duties around the house, and they look after siblings. So the text also makes the observation, rightly so, that it's almost like, in a way, adolescence is disappearing. It's estimated Canadian teenagers spend about 50 hours a week on work, schoolwork, housework, a paid part-time job. And I have to tell you that being in the classroom with the younger generation, I personally see this. You know, in some ways, being young is still being young, and it will always be that way. But in other ways, I see that being young is not as carefree as it once was for a lot of students. That they seem to have a lot more anxiety and worry and to carry a lot more responsibility than either when I did or, at any other group of young people. And like I said, it's led to this question or this idea of, is adolescence vanishing? That stage of life slowly eroding as young people find themselves having to take on adult responsibility and worry at a much younger stage in life. I've discussed this with students in class, and I admit to them that when I was in high school in the late 80s, yeah, we were expected to work and do well, but we simply didn't seem to have the same level of stress and anxiety that students do now. And as a professor, I can see it. As the semester proceeds, every semester, I see the general atmosphere of a class change. The general environment they carry with them becomes drained. Their anxiety levels rise. So as the text points out, it's like this stage of life is vanishing. So let's kind of pull this all together with a summary and very briefly review everything we talked about. So, started this week talking about what socialization is and how important the childhood years are regarding this. We looked specifically, again, at childhood socialization, beginning with Freud, and how he said a sense of self begins through denied gratification, and Charles Horton Cooley with the looking glass self. Our sense of self develops, at least in part, by how we think other people see us, whether that is a correct perception or not, and how certain people in our lives are more significant to us than others in regards to how this develops. Then we talked about George Herbert Mead, the I and the me, different stages of development in terms of developing a sense of self and role taking. And if everything goes according to plan and a person develops properly, this will result in a generalized other. Then I focused on gender, looking at family, who is an agent of primary socialization, how your family affects your socialization. School is a secondary agent of socialization. We looked at the self-fulfilling prophecy using the Rosenthal-Jacobson experiment as an example. And I looked at the hidden curriculum, which is essentially everything that you have to study in school that is not academic, everything that's not part of the curriculum documents. The third agent of socialization is your peer group, which is also a secondary agent of socialization. How the influence of peer groups has greatly influenced over the last several decades. And this actually serves a purpose. Peer groups help you through the stage of adolescence. But then I also brought up, all the conflict that can occur with parents. And the mass media, also a secondary agent of socialization. And I looked specifically at gender roles in the media, the whole princess ideal. We looked at re-socialization, total institutions, the military, that sort of thing. Re-socialization in terms of hazing, with an example. And again, re-socialization can take place even if it is against the person's will. And then finally, we looked at anticipatory socialization, how we prepare for different roles in our lives, and difficulties that can occur now during childhood. This is socialization from a sociological perspective. Ties back in quite a bit to culture, and it will tie in quite a bit to next week's topic, which is social interaction. I want to mention that, this also ties into research methods, because as I bring up these different studies and as I bring up these different examples, it's important to not even just take me at my word, but to think about, okay, well, she talks about this study, how many kids were involved, and how is it handled, and how is the purpose explained to participants, and was there informed consent? So I hope you're beginning to realize how all of these different areas that we're looking at affect each other and tie into each other. So again, if you need to pause a lecture take it in chunks and bits, that's certainly your prerogative. If you want to go back and rewatch something, do that. And don't forget to complete your evaluation for this week.